Okay, we're live now. Uh, Greetings, everybody. On behalf of Beacon House School System, the organizer of the School of Tomorrow events, I'd like to welcome all of you to A World of Tomorrow from Darkness to Light, the 12th edition of SOT events and its fully virtual non-profit SOT event. This series was launched by Beacon House in the year 2000 as a part of the CSR to help inform the direction of the organization while also engaging global communities in conversations shaping the future of schools and societies. For those, so I would like to introduce myself. I am Narjis Haider. I'm currently a deputy head at one of the Beacon House branches. And my main experience has been education technology and use of technology in classrooms, and hence I'm the moderator of this session. And I would now like to introduce our esteemed panelists today. We have Dr. Ulrik Christensen from Massachusetts, who has spent the last 25 years developing education technology from interventional reading for K-4 students over adaptive and personalized learning from retail staff to medical doctor. His interests are pragmatic approaches to making blending learning designs work in real life and at scale, as well as intelligent technologies to get computers closer to better facilitate learning when learners cannot get help from teachers or other adults. Next, we have Ms. Jessica White from Munich, Germany. Jessica is a senior consultant of education and was a research mentor at UCL for Educate. Educate, the EU-backed initiative that supports EdTech startups in efficacy-led improved services. In addition to her wealth of experience as an EdTech consultant, she spearheaded beta testing, education strategies, and media exposure with EdTech startups. She also works with an Austrian charity called Think and collaborated with Google Arts and Cultural Institute, empowering women in India through arts, education, and technology. Welcome, Ms. Jessica, to this panel. Then we have Mr. Sibel Mufti. He's a biomedical engineer and robotics education consultant who has worked in engineering and tech education for many years. He has been an instructor at the George Washington University, where he started a community service program around STEM education and mentorship for DC public school students. Mr. Sibel Mufti has also been a part of Beacon House for some time during his career. So welcome again, Sibel, and looking forward to a great discussion with you. So before we begin, I'd like to set the context. Frankenstein to Alexa, questioning our obsession with artificial intelligence. The relationship between man and his creation has always been a contradictory dilemma. The mortal drive to bring life into the innate creates a kind of parental separation anxiety. AI, in the form of a literary monster or digital machine, continues to pose complex questions as we give up more of our data to breathe life into other forms. So I'd like to begin with Dr. Ulrik and his views on artificial intelligence and the future of artificial intelligence. And then I would request each one of my panelists to give their views as well. Yes, Dr. Ulrik, let's begin.
So I think that there is a very widespread, there is a big echo. Sibel, could you just try to mute maybe? That worked. I think there is a massive
headphones
of the impact of AI on education, but I actually think that the most immediate impact is an indirect one. AI will pose a massive change of how we will work in the future, what jobs there will be to get. And I think that impact on what we're teaching, how we're developing as humans will be much bigger than the impact of AI directly on education. There is a lot of fear about what AI can do, but I think we're far, far away from AI taking over the role of teachers, which is often the question, can AI predict how teachers should do their job or how students should learn? We can use AI for isolated things, but even 20 years after we began to use AI in medicine, we're far away from having AI be the artificial physician. And medicine is way simpler than education. So I think we're decades away from AI having that George Orwell 1984 impact on education, whereas AI will immediately over the next few years impact our ability to deliver education and do technology. And as a very simple example, one of the things where it can be used is my children have been crying over too much homework since we moved to the US several years ago, almost every week. We can now use AI to predict what is the impact of the assignments we give children, how much time can we expect that they will be doing, so that we as teachers, or even as the people who are developing these things, can now have much better predictions of what will happen when we put this in the hands of the children, and therefore course correct before they end up with 7 hours of homework. But it will be simpler, much more isolated things than that, like that we will see the impact of AI on, except for the fact that we probably need to rethink what we're teaching and what kind of skill sets we're developing, because it will be a different kind of jobs, because a lot of the simple jobs will be heavily impacted by AI.
Thank you, Dr. Ulrik. Jessica, like throughout my growing years, we've seen so many movies and read so many science fiction books talking about analytics and AI and things like Minority Report, the view of AI in Minority Report, and then I, Robot, and how it can go wrong. So what is your take on the ethics of artificial intelligence, and how should it be used, and how is it being used?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think those predictions that we saw in movies are not far wrong, such as the Minority Report. We see a lot of those kinds of predictive analytics about how people can be judged about what their actions will be in the future based on historical precedents that have been taken from before. So we are in now that age that has been depicted by films, etc. Obviously not all of them, but some of them have started to become true. So ways that we can somehow look into mitigating some of those effects of perhaps predicting falsely is by looking at the types of data sets that are helping to make those predictions and to make those decisions. So obviously AI recognizes patterns, and those patterns are based on volume and variety and velocity, and often the veracity of it takes out the noise of what is not relevant. But unfortunately, when that happens, then sometimes for example, if you put in, if you're searching for something like a criminal and then something like a certain type of criminal comes up, such as with it's been known that what comes up in the search is that of someone of a different color, so not a white person, but with black skin, then they are classed as a criminal. And so these kinds of predictive searches or predictive data sets that are making decisions are often reproducing the biases that have been mitigated for years with deconstruction that we've done in academia. So it's about understanding what those data sets are predicting. Obviously, those data sets are really useful for sifting through lots of large amounts of information, but then it's also about understanding how can we change and how can we influence those data sets with ethics, not just one code of ethics, but an ethics that is context based within, and also is informed by public policy and open debate. So that's the case with policing, with the justice system, but also with education. So I think that those kinds of things can mitigate the kinds of bias in predictive analytics.
Thank you, Jessica. And now, Sibel, I'd like to ask you that so far, consumers like me, like people who are just looking at technology in everyday life, the only experience of AI that I can understand now is Google Analytics and how it is tracking my likes or dislikes, everything I put in Google, I suddenly get recommendations, or it shows me a digital footprint of where I've been or where I should be, again, giving me recommendation based on places I've visited. So what is your view of this? How are users getting impacted by artificial intelligence in society? Sibel?
That's an amazing question. I think Jessica touched on this. I'm sorry, I think there's a lot of lag on my end.
All right. Dr. Ulrik, would you like to comment on this?
Yes. So I think that Jessica has a really valid point in terms of some of the limitations and the risks we have using big data to make predictions in education. One of the things that sets this apart is we don't have outcome parameters to train these models, the same way as if we are in medicine are trying to optimize a blood parameter or other things where we know this is what we are aiming towards. If we think about learning styles or some of the other things where we've thought that we could stereotype learners into certain categories, that has later shown to not be the case. I think that we've seen very little impact in education from those kind of models, from the big data driven, the neural networks, where we have seen impact. And I want to be clear about this, that there's been massive impact from other kinds of AI-like technologies, like a lot of the work we've done in adaptive learning, where you can optimize what is happening when students are studying on their own. When you're left without help from somebody else, without a human brain, we can really significantly optimize how students are spending their time, recommend to them, you should focus on this rather than that, and analyze their performance. But it's not the classic AI, which is based on very large data set. It's actually based on biological approaches to molding or building the models around the individual as you go, rather than looking at very large population data sets. Those population data sets have not been nearly as impactful as some have hoped for, or some have feared, which is also why we've for years actually been actively throwing away data, because to protect the privacy of failing. Like a very important part of education is to be allowed to fail and be in a safe environment where the stuff you've done in the past will not follow you forever. So one of the first things we realized years ago when we started doing this at scale at McGraw-Hill, where we had 5-6 million learners using this every semester, we actually threw away their data from year to year, despite the fact we could probably get a little bit of information out of some things that could have transfer to how we made predictions for the next subject or the next for the next year. It was of so little impact that we saw much bigger effect out of just letting people fail safely, start from scratch next time, and then we build a new model around you again. For the very important effect of the psychological feeling of not being constantly surveilled or under surveillance and tracked.
Yes, thank you. And that is one of my concerns about being under surveillance all the time. You know, now we're in an age where everybody has a smartwatch or has a cell phone with all those features. That means we can be tracked anywhere, anytime. So, Jessica, my question to you is, can AI be trusted in fields like psychology or law or social policy making or environmental sciences? Do you think that AI can benefit these fields? Should it be used there, or should we avoid using it where human emotions are involved?
Excellent question. I think that having AI in humanistic fields is important, partly because humanistic fields and social sciences should not be left out of the way in which we can actually utilize AI for managing information and detecting the needs. So, for example, in the environmental sciences, then AI is very important for detecting where, for example, you can plant mangroves within a specific area that is probably too large and probably too complex for a human mind or eye to understand in a short period of time, that is needed to plant those mangroves with a drone AI, for example. But obviously there needs to be that AI-assisted technology with the human decisions. So how is that, for for example, that drone going to then affect the livelihoods of where it's going to plant? Is it going to benefit the farmers by planting there? Those kinds of moral decisions can be made by an AI, but they might actually make mistakes because there are many different implicit factors that they can't take into account. Therefore, that kind of complex decision would need to be made by humans. So it's about using AI in the human sciences and sociology and education and law in a way that the moral decisions and the complex decisions that we have to make. Because, you know, as Ulrik was saying, then there is a large amount of information that can be given feedback, that can be given to teachers within education, that looks at the time on the task, the difficulty of the level, the complexity of the task, and how students are able to manage that. But then the decision about whether that student should continue on that particular topic to explore further and go deeper more as a specialist, or to explore and go into other subjects based on the context of their exams, their social circumstances, the stress that they may be having at home or with times of a pandemic. All those contextual factors cannot necessarily be taken into account by AI because they're implicit and they require a lot more information than can be decided through the input of the data. There are now data sets that are using implicit information from the context in the environment. But the problem with those kinds of implicit information is that, as I mentioned before, it's often biased. So there needs always to be that intervention from the humans to work with the AI in a kind of an assisted role. The AI is assisting the humans rather than the other way around.
I think
excellent insight, Jessica. And I'd like Dr. Ulrik to elaborate on this, where my question to you, Dr. Ulrik, that we are in the pandemic and Jessica just spoke about the pandemic. So how do you think that AI can benefit the human race in controlling pandemics or natural disasters? Do you think it has any benefits for us? Can it do something?
Of course, but I think that it's a good example of how afraid we are of these technologies, that one of the simplest approaches would be to use trackers to see if you've been exposed. And the majority of the world's population are hesitant to do that. Completely safe compared to many of the other things that we would have to do to make it work in education. So I think that of course we can do that. And we have done tons of education during this pandemic of healthcare personnel. We have been able to roll out and use AI-driven technologies to rapidly change guidelines around how hospital personnel is handling resuscitations, where you move a lot of air when you're ventilating patients, and therefore they're particularly risky. And I think that the ability to train personnel without getting them into a room, obviously there are a lot of applications, and the world for remote learning and e-learning has probably been advanced 10, 20 years just over the last 6 months. But I do think it's really important when we have the discussion about AI in education that we don't only think of it, or we don't primarily think of it as what would it take to have AI substitute the full learning and teaching experience? Because in that case, it's light years away, or 100 years away, maybe at least decades away, before you will have an AI-driven thing fully teach these less exact sciences like art or history or something else. But that's not where AI will have the impact and have a big impact. It will be in assisting functionality in ways where you assist humans in doing their job better. So we've used AI, and we use AI, and just a different kind of AI in every single subject you can think of. I think we've built it in more than 2,000 different academic subjects. We built AI-driven curricula. But it's very, very important to see what is the AI used for. Yes, it is certain kind of AI is used to figure out how do we optimize what people are focusing on. We use AI for that. But we use many-fold more AI to enable human subject matter experts to build high enough quality that can be delivered through these technologies, so that we can actually move the cost base for human curation of content. We've cut that by somewhere between a factor of 20 and 40 over the last 10 years, which is a much bigger impact, direct impact of using AI technologies. So if you have that art teacher, you have that social sciences teacher or professor, if you can enable that person to do their job many times better using AI, we don't have to get fixated on what does it take to fully make an AI-based education environment, because that's far, far, far away. I want to just make one correction to the paraphrasing that was made earlier. We've not been throwing away data to hide that we could be failing. We're throwing away data to let students feel safe, that we don't let their failures or their experiments follow them, so that you forever will have to, let's say that you had a bad semester, you did some things where you were not too proud of the project you made there, to make it safe to be experimenting and not have your data follow you forever. So it's not as much because the AI would be failing, it's a matter of keeping the students safe in an environment where they feel like the data will not follow me forever. That's why we're trashing them.
All right, thank you very much. That was a really interesting insight and a perspective of looking at AI. Sibel, welcome back. And now my question to you. Do you think that people are investing in AI research motivated to do this in an attempt to live longer?
I think we have to ask a question, how do we define a person? So if we're defining them by the choices they'll make, well, we already have algorithms that are doing that. If we look at Amazon predicting what people will buy, if we look at Instagram predicting what people want to see, maybe you can start asking questions. How would they respond in unprecedented situations? But I think everyone has to make a call as to whether they think that their choices define a person. So, and I think it would be very interesting to see what the discussion of ethics and religion are around that, but that's, I think, far, far in the future. Realistically, most of the applications of AI seem to be very narrow. They're specifically happening to achieve a certain goal, usually for profit. And I think that even though there are many people who, like Elon Musk and some of the Google founders, who are looking at things like immortality and increasing lifespan, we are talking mostly about biological enhancements. So, advances in medicine are really where I've seen that conversation happening. So I don't think right now AI will be talking about lifespan. It's more about how it can help companies increase profits, and that's part of the discussion as to why we might have some ethical issues when companies are trying to do that.
Thank you, Sibel. Now, based on all this discussion, Dr. Ulrik, my question to you, that even before Snowden disclosed how our data was being manipulated, people constantly had the fear of data manipulation, and now the big debate about Google Analytics and Facebook constantly being taken to court with their bugs and data getting leaked. So how do you think that this can be prevented, or how can we teach people or the human race to deal with the limitations or the dangers of AI and accept it as part of their life?
So I think that education will benefit from just following suit for what is happening anyway in society. So if you take the significantly tightened European data privacy rules, that is enough to secure, and that, in my opinion, it's those kind of initiatives that will help us be able to still benefit from using technology, but protect individuals against the mishaps of the past. One of the direct implications of it is, and we felt like we built these high capacity, high volume, high use systems for 2 decades now. The pressure on server technologies, despite the fact that we have Moore's law in play, where we have exponential growth of the computing power, we have never seen more pressure on building high performance systems, because we need to live up to these data privacy rules. But it's a good thing, it's a great thing that we now have massive pressure on the commercial players in this particularly, that we have to not step across the line and that we have to protect the data, we have to get rid of it again, we have to get consent. And every time that you're passing data around in this, you have to control it, you have to be able to trace it down and delete it later. So I think that the general rules and regulations of society will have to deal with this. I don't think we in education need to go neither further or challenge that. I do believe that, particularly if we take the new gold standards set by in Europe by the GDPR rules, I think that is the direction to go.
Thank you. Jessica, since you have been part of the EU's Commission on Education and AI, so I'd like to ask you that at what age do we start teaching children about this, and how do we prepare the next generation for the benefits of AI and how they can use it to their benefit rather than it becoming a hazard for them?
Yeah. So two great questions, and ones that I've really just been thinking about a lot with early education, because the way that AI learns often is, especially now, is much like a child, recognizing patterns between different language constructions, and the way that then you can match language with visual images. So in fact, children already know about AI from a very early age of just like being a child. And so I think it's about then looking at what they're working on already, and then applying that to how it's similar to the way in which AI has been or has developed. Some great examples that I've seen from my colleagues, associates in Singapore, are, for example, with the way in which they're teaching about AI, not directly through programming, but for example, when you separate the trash from paper and glass and bio waste, then you have to classify what will go in the paper, what will go in trash. Often it's a little bit confusing. Does that milk carton belong in paper or does it plastic? It depends on what is actually there. You have to recognize the components that it's made up of. Sometimes it's not so easy. And so this kind of classification that a human has to do, children have to do as they begin to learn to live in their environment, that can then be applied as an analogy to how AI actually classifies information. And then we can look deeper at the types of tags that we are applying ourselves within real life situations and see how that can be applied in an AI situation or is being applied, and can we improve that? And the feedback that we get from children's wonderful kind of discovery minds, I'm sure, can actually inform our adult creations. And so I think that if we can listen more to the ways as early as possible, in the ways in which children classify the world that they see around them within the systems that we've built, then we can learn how to classify our AI systems better so that they're more open and inclusive. So as early as possible. Obviously, we have to wait till the children start to speak, but I think it would be a good idea to start as early as possible, but not necessarily with screen time programming, but more understanding how they classify in the real world and show them how that's how AI works.
All right. Thank you very much. That was really interesting to know. Sibel, now, since you spoke about Elon Musk, I want to ask you that AI also offers benefits to people with disabilities or special needs. And like, for example, with the self-driving cars or self-driving trains, do you think that there are new innovations coming up to help people with disabilities or special needs, and how AI can benefit them?
I think it's I think one of the most exciting parts about the development of AI, even if it's often very narrow in its focus, is how it can level the playing field for people with disabilities, including learning disabilities. I'm definitely someone who has advocated for and has learning disabilities, and we talk a lot about accommodations when we're talking about things like that. But if we do have some systems that are able to basically work with someone's abilities, no matter how different they are, I think it's we'd be able to see a lot more. We get to see what students are truly capable of, instead of the issues we see with trying to make education fit everyone in its exact similar format. On the medical side, I'm really excited by the innovations we've made in terms of people who are paralyzed. There was recently a device that was approved for people who have even been paralyzed for up to 14 years, and we're able to get them to start walking again. So I think there's a lot of very exciting stuff there, and I would be very intrigued to see Pakistan start to join that, because we have so many people who are trained in software and so many more who are getting trained in software. So I think the education community could actually really help push that forward. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and Dr. Ulrik, would you like to elaborate on this?
So yes, we've actually seen over the last 10, 12 years that the use of intelligent technologies when students are learning on their own or pupils are learning on their own, we can level the playing field significantly to the level where in the past, the norm was that we looked at how far students were getting after 45 minutes, and then we put a label on them and saying, you're a C student and you're a B student. In the future, and we've shown this with millions and millions of learners, that whether you have a learning disability or you, for one reason or another, we can have mastery is the same. It's the time to mastery that varies, that is the variable now. And I think that that's a very important difference, that if you can make technologies that allows you to pursue mastery despite the fact that you need more time or you need to have this explained in another way, that completely changes the dynamics of how we can structure our education system, because our education system traditionally has been structured to figure out who were able to get to a certain point in a limited amount of time. And we have tens of millions of learners through these systems now, and it's a very, very homogeneous story that almost all people can get to full mastery. It's just a matter of how much time. So if you can handle that, and that's where and it's not big data driven AI, it's another kind of AI that is needed, or another kind of intelligence that is needed to solve this, because it's needed to be very precise to that individual. You cannot take a population and say, based on how a population learns, Sibel needs this help now. You need to get really precise on figuring out exactly how is Sibel learning different from Jessica. But if you do this and you deploy these systems, and that's what we have over a decade experience in, you can actually really benefit from this. And it was already the early systems worked for that. I remember one of the first emails that I still keep in my treasure box is from a dyslexic student who's told our sales rep in the Midwest of the US that he had failed twice in anatomy and physiology, but because this was the first time that had the patience to wait for him, he would now get the job, the dream job he wanted. And I think that and after that, I began to study students with learning disabilities. And one of the things we found was that they may have bigger plateaus where they have bigger periods of time where they're struggling and heavily struggling, but you can actually get them out of that. And one of the fascinating early findings was that we can accelerate them back on the learning path they were on before. So they may drop off for a period of time, but then they make some sprints. And actually, it isn't like, yes, they may have a slower slope, but if you can get them through the phases where they're struggling, they can't get through it, very similar to all the literature on creative struggling or productive persistence, you can really benefit, or you can really help a lot of students with learning disabilities with these kind of technologies.
Okay, that's really great. Now, I'm going to ask this next question, and I want each one of you to comment on it, starting with Sibel. The greatest fear that humans have from AI is the loss of jobs and livelihoods. So how can developers and employers ease this stress for them? What change do universities and schools and education need to bring? What kind of skill sets do we need to prepare our future generations to remove this fear of loss of jobs and livelihoods because of AI? So I'll begin with Jessica, and then Sibel, and then Dr. Ulrik.
Yeah. Okay. I think mainly it needs to be about looking at the ways in which we can actually train people to think about them. They're not only in one specific role or one specific, that their whole life is actually a series of a learning journey. So there may be some automated decisions that are being made that then have some risk. For example, with tax, there is a lot that you can do now with automated systems. And teachers, often I've heard teachers when I've spoken with them saying, oh, well, you don't need us. And I think that there are different roles that, for example, teachers can take on that gives them more space and more room to learn, whilst the AI is actually assisting them with the very kind of routine tasks that we talked about, such as marking, such as maybe analyzing what their class needs to focus on in terms of what the class has mastered and how they can go in the future. So I think it's more about AI can allow those people that have been trained to train further in different skills that they don't necessarily need to work on if the AI had not been invented. So, for example, with tax, then you may have everything automated in terms of sending off to the finance office, but then they can also look into how can we make these tax laws more ethical, more moral? How can we allow for less corruption? There's a lot of research that then tax consultants can then look into that they otherwise wouldn't have the chance to look into. The same with teachers. Teachers can become researchers within their field, a lot more than just kind of office clerks or looking after the children like a caretaker. So I think it's more about looking at the role as not disappearing, but more expanding and having the time to expand your role because the more routine tasks are being taken care of. Obviously, AI can also go a step further and not only do routine tasks, but that's another question, I think.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Yes, Sibel, would you like to comment on this?
Oh, absolutely. Jessica made a really good point about having a lifelong learning journey. And I think we also have to say that even if a role does stop existing, referring to our previous discussion where almost everyone is able to get back on a similar learning path, I think that means that if a role disappears, people have the ability to train and go into new roles. AI will also add jobs and create more opportunities. So I think as far as we go with students, part of it is teaching them to be okay with change, and then also giving them the mental skill sets to keep learning and keep adapting and being okay with change. So I think we're talking about much more psychological, soft skills in terms of how they approach things. And when I was working with Beacon House, we talked a lot about this. About building students to be okay with and learning how to be almost, shall we say, creative in the way they apply things. So, maybe it's a good thing. It allows humans to start to achieve, more people to start to achieve more of their potential over time. At least that's how I feel about it.
So, Sibel and Jessica, what I've understood from this is that then we also need to rethink the curriculum in our schools and probably introduce design thinking as a regular part of the curriculum for them to be able to adapt and adjust to AI and what they can do with it. So what do you think, Dr. Ulrik? Have I interpreted their views correctly?
Yes, I completely agree that the immediate implication is that you will have to reskill and upskill many, many times. You can't just get a degree with 3 letters and then that's what you're doing for the rest of your life. And I think that learning to learn needs to play a much bigger role. Like instead of having it as an ultimate goal that you need to be able to use a theorem or recall the name for something. So I think that 21st century skills, communication, critical thinking, collaboration, and creativity would be classic examples of things, but also what Jessica implicated, like ethics, morality, citizenship, which are things that we're not nearly as structured around accomplishing in the education system today. Although it has been part of the reason why I think we built our education system as we did it, but I think it's something that needs to play a much, much bigger role in the future. And what is, it's tempting to jump to the conclusion that because you have Google and you have advanced computers and you have AI. Humans don't need to learn math anymore, no need to learn X, Y, or Z. But I actually think that the scary conclusion from our research and our work in this field is that you probably need to do both. That we probably need to learn more stuff in the future, and at the same time we also need to be able to put it in a much broader context in terms of what humans do best. So the things that set us apart as humans is that we can integrate really complex pictures and bodies of information really, really fast. Things that we've not seen before, solve problems that we cannot describe immediately. That's what humans will do much more than doing ledgers and moving numbers around in the future in big books. And what that implies is we need to learn to think that way. We need to learn that way so that when we encounter it later in life, that we are ready to readjust. And I think that COVID-19 has been a good example of it. It used to take American Heart Association 5 years to decide on the changes in the guidelines, and suddenly they had to roll out a change to every single healthcare provider in the world in a few weeks, simply because we had to figure out how do we adjust. They had to develop teaching material, they had to develop new guidelines, it has insurance implications, all sorts of things where and this is one of the largest professional certification programs in the world, where everybody needs to be agile and adjust in another way. And I think that is a mini example of something I think we'll see over and over again in the future. And the problem is massive. I don't think you can hide. And I think I'm not as optimistic as Jessica in terms of the jobs will still stay there. I think that a lot will just expand. I think we will lose jobs. I think there are lots of jobs that will not be necessary in the future anymore. And McKinsey's early estimate was 1 billion to 1.5 billion jobs. But on top of that, we also have about 25 million climate refugees a year. Just because of that are also adding to the pool of labor that could have been used for more trivial tasks. So if you look at a 40-year horizon, we're looking at maybe 2.5 billion jobs that we need to rethink. So I think that it is a really serious threat, and it's a really serious demand on our education system that we figure out fast how do we prepare people better to go into roles that are much more that are much more dependent on human thinking rather than the mechanical industrialized jobs that we've had in the past, and the jobs that are most under threat from these technological advancements.
Thank you, Dr. Ulrik. Based on this, I'd like to pose a question, which any one of you can answer. That are the universities thinking about this? Are they thinking about changing the degrees or the options available to students to prepare themselves for the new world, the new jobs that are going to be there, and not the current ones or the ones that are going to go away? Because the big question about schools is, that whatever happens in a school is driven by what is expected from a university. So it's more about a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up. So any one of you can comment on this.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about transformation rather than just like cutting off and then, okay, there is a completely new approach that's needed. So there may be, vocational learning is very big in Germany and is becoming larger in the UK as well because of the cost of education for universities. So there are many people that are being trained in very kind of technical, industrial professions. And I think just to kind of eradicate that kind of learning is, it's almost impossible because there's so much of it. So it's about then how can we transform that? And I think that vocational learning, not so much in Germany, but certainly in the UK, had some sort of, it was not really seen as a serious study until now. Obviously that's changing, but I think that what can be added is that if you do vocational studies, you don't necessarily only need to learn how to do things technically, but you can also learn about the ethics that you're of how you're using those machines. For example, there are many programmers that I've worked with in the past, developers and so on, who haven't learned about ethics because they haven't had the access to them within their education, within their vocational education. So how can we then add the social sciences and humanities to those vocational subjects so that there is, starting from what they know, which may be a very technical specialism, and then building across that. So there is a kind of mitigation of risk of, okay, you also know about all these other things, so you don't have to just operate the machine. You can also manage and invent and innovate and make decisions. So yeah, I think it's about not necessarily making a cut and designing completely new curriculum and completely new jobs, but starting from where we are and seeing how we can expand and transform.
Okay, any comments on that, Sibel or Dr. Ulrik?
I mean, I can just put in a small one, which is I study engineering in the States, and I still remember a very basic conversation with a professor where my concern was that I didn't remember absolutely everything in all of my courses. And of course, I come from the same Pakistani, Middle Eastern background where rote learning and making sure that you remember everything is very important. But I was not only assured by this professor and then by mentors later on that the main thing was remembering the basics so that you could then apply that and learn and move forward. And I think I've also seen that personally in the roles that I've worked in, which is that nowadays people are looking more at your ability to adapt and then fill a role instead of hiring someone who fits it perfectly. Yeah.
Yes,
I think it's a very important part for a lot of universities, and the education system is beginning to get it. If you look at a college down the road from here, Northeastern, that has moved from being an average ranked university to being one of the top universities in the US. Why? The number one thing that they're known for is that they send the students out in co-ops where they actually get embedded with real organizations, real companies as part of their studies. And I was thrilled when my oldest daughter chose to go there a few years ago. And I've never seen her happier than when she was taking care of squid in a marine lab down in Woodhull this last winter, and walking us around the lab, showing us that that's the kind of context that I think that we have missed for years. But of course, it's super encouraging to see a top university thriving on exactly that change. And I think that that's something we will see a lot more of, because that is you will have to teach in another way. You won't get to these at more advanced, more higher order thinking skills just through reading more books or sitting in more lectures. You have to work with your personal development in completely different ways, applying it. But the good news is that they're seeing it, and they are changing. I think a large number of corporations are changing as well. We work a lot with corporate learning and development departments, and we're seeing a tsunami of departments and chief learning officers and chief human resources officers who are saying, we know we need to change. We know we need to rethink the way we take responsibility. And as PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC's chief learning officer has been referring to many times, is maybe in the future, higher education is delivering the undyed cloth to the companies that are then dyeing it in the color and the patterns they need. So that we see this as much more of a handover and as a collaboration and a continuum, rather than you do education and then you go work. It's not likely that that will be the future. It's much more likely that it will be a close collaboration where you learn from you start school and then until you decide to retire at some point.
All right, that was really, really interesting and good to hear that some universities are actually rethinking what to teach and how to teach, because like jobs and education go hand in hand. And if the skill set that we are developing now is not the one that they would require in the future, that's where the problem and the concern for people about losing jobs lies. So do you think that any governments are thinking about it or making policies about how they will be embedding AI across their policies and practices? Is there an example of any such place, any part of the world which is thinking seriously about this, about the paradigm shift from the conventional jobs to the future jobs and the skills that people require?
Go ahead, Jessica.
No,
Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, in Europe, there is a huge investment in AI and how that can be taught within schools across universities, and as well as how that is transforming jobs within Bavaria alone. Local government, the federal government here, has actually invested. I think the figure is beyond 3 million. So in order to advance AI research, but also to understand how that is affecting jobs, as well as how to teach it within the schools, particularly with the pandemic. So, of course, governments are thinking within this direction. And the important thing is, I think, is to bring in more kinds of researchers. It's important to have computer scientists on this kind of research, but in addition, I think it's important to bring in the social sciences, to bring in humanities, and also the general public, civic education, to inform the kinds of research and the directions that AI is going. So obviously that is being taken into account, but I think there's more that could be done in that area moving forward.
Thank you, Jessica. Dr. Ulrik, you were saying.
There are for sure both countries and ministries of education. I've spoken to several just the last few months. I think more than starting with AI, what they often start with is, how should we restructure this? How do we move towards the education of the future, including AI, which I think is a healthy approach to this. OECD, for instance, is designing the next generation of PISA and the next one called PILA, all around how do you design this so that it incorporates these next generation skills that are needed in a world that is dominated, like, has been influenced by AI. But also, if you take an organization that I, until recently, was on the board of Mastery Transcript Consortium, that is redefining how do we characterize students, how do we hand off students from high school to colleges and say, how do we now give them credit for all the other things they've learned than just how to get a high SAT or ACT score? So I think that at all different levels, whether it's the school systems, whether it's the policymakers, or even organizations like OECD, I think there is a very, very significantly increased attention to solving this problem and solving it fast.
That's really great. So as we're nearing the end of our discussion, I would like each one of you to tell us one positive and one negative, or I wouldn't call it negative, but a limitation at the moment, an aspect of AI that you think is a great benefit to the humankind and one that needs more work on, something that requires more research and more work.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the benefits that I've seen recently is with virtual teaching assistants, particularly with natural language processing. I'm really excited about this field in the way that natural language can be recognized from the students and the teachers. For example, when you have virtual teaching assistants who are supporting students with mathematics, for example, and a student is perhaps struggling, and the virtual assistant asks questions in order to understand where the student is at. So the virtual assistant may ask questions such as, how are you doing? And so asking a kind of sentiment question, emotional question, and the student may reply, well, I'm not sure about this. And so the virtual assistant may then reply, have you maybe tried addition instead of subtraction? And so by using this kind of hedging language, rather than you're doing it wrong, do it again, which is kind of confrontational, then the student can relax within the situation. And as Ulrik pointed out, they may take longer to achieve that kind of mastery that is needed in order to complete or pass the examination, but they'll get there with that kind of support that is being done with the virtual assistant through natural language processing. So I'm really excited about that.
That's great.
And one thing that I think is not going so well is the way in which Obviously, bias is very strong. So I was trying out an application just very recently, which is using a combination of recognizing text to then transfer to image by using masking. And I put in something like a find or create an image based on a text, which was like a doctor in an office. And the image came up with a white male. So there are many black female doctors. So why did we not see that? So these are the kinds of implicit knowledge that AI is grasping from the large data sets, which is still biased towards a certain ethnicity and a certain gender. So I would like to see more of that being mitigated in the future.
That's great. Yes, Dr. Ulrik.
So I think that there is tremendous promise in using different kinds of AI to facilitate and make both teachers' time more valuable and handle more kinds of students and level the playing field. Like, those implications are pretty significant and pretty obvious. The thing that frustrates me as significantly almost is the amount of mindless investments that are made in technologies that have no scientific background, and we ask very few questions about the evidence and the science behind it. Not even simple things like, does it even make sense for our teachers if it works this way? Where we have a wild west of AI-based technologies and often underinvestments in specific technologies where we have lots of small projects. But I think that we have to respect the fact that some of this is like putting a fiber optic cable across the Atlantic Ocean, or building a major bridge or a major highway, that the infrastructure investments needed to facilitate this is very similar to building the internet or doing other things that are at enormous proportions. And I think that we make the fixation errors constantly, that we focus on the things that are either sexy or scary, or something where it fits our preconceived notions about what technology might or might not do, rather than having a more methodical approach to how do we build these changes at scale and the supporting infrastructure for it. So that's where the hype around AI is kind of counterproductive, and the amount of snake oil out there is leaving us with a slower progression towards something that will work than we would otherwise have. So my big plea to everybody I meet is, like, let's get as close to building things in science, to randomized controlled studies, at least have strong scientific construct validity behind what we are doing, and constantly teach people and encourage people to try to separate what works or is likely to work from what is less likely to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Ulrik. Sibel, please.
Sure. So I'm very excited about how AI can be used to help students with disabilities, whether that is creating accommodations or adapting the task for them, or changing how the actual lesson is being delivered so it can work with them. The thing that I am concerned about is, and I'm glad you're doing this event, is that AI is and technology affects us all. So I think it's very important that everyone knows about how the basics work, and they know about what's going on, so that it can be a collaborative, democratic process like many other things are. Technology often gets siloed into the side where only people who are very interested or very educated talk about it. So I'm hoping that more people will become educated and join the discussion and help direct what happens.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot from all of you throughout this 1 week that we have worked together. And I would like to thank our audience for being here and listening to this great interaction. Thank you to our conference lead sponsor, UBL, the event organizers, and our esteemed panelists. Thank you, each one of you. Without you, today's discussion and session would not have been possible. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Nara. Thank you.
Thank you.